This is Friday, the 15th of January, 2016. And we are gathered here to discuss the origin or genesis of the Nevada Women's History Project. We have Fritzie Erickson, Linda Wyckoff, Lynn Bremer, Kathy Noneman, and Gwen Clancy is our videographer, and Julie Forbes is our recorder. Let's start off, Fritzie, by doing a little introduction of yourself and how you met Jean.
Okay. I'm Fritzie Erickson, and I was president and CEO of the Nevada Women's Fund from late 1984 until 2005, so 20-some years that I was with the Women's Fund. I met Jean Ford probably through my friend Sue Wagner when I was in Carson City for some legislative issue. I had been working with Congressman Jim Santini, and I often went down for sessions to see how things were going to affect any of the legislation that happened to be moving through Congress. When Jean first came to talk to me in probably late 94 or early 1995 about the Women's History Project and wanted to see if the Nevada Women's Fund might be interested, I was thrilled. I'd spent a lot of time working on women's issues for the congressman, and I was always interested in history, and Jean just had a wonderful way about her that said, I think you need to get involved in this, and I said, right on. So I took it to the board of directors, and they were very enthusiastic about it, and they decided to make the Nevada Women's History Project a delegate agency. So that was really how I got to know Jean and how I got involved with the Nevada Women's History Project. At that time, they were not only looking for a place to call a home, because they had been looking at other organizations, but I think our mission fit them best, but they were also looking for a place to be. And we didn't have room for them at that time, but we did take them on as the delegate agency. And I continued to attend their board meetings, their advisory meetings, and I was always so impressed with all the women who were involved and their commitment to women in the state of Nevada.
And Linda, how did you get involved?
I first met Jean Ford in 1990. I went to work for a company called the Reno Tahoe Company, which was a destination management company in Reno that was owned by Bill Thornton. And Jean was the manager of the company at that point in time. So she was my boss for about 6 months. And then she left the Reno Tahoe Company. And about 6 months after that, I left the Reno Tahoe Company. But Jean and I had pretty much become friends. And so we stayed in touch. We didn't stay in close touch, but we stayed in touch. And that was still only 1990 or so. And so when she started the ball rolling on the Nevada Women's History Project, it coincided with my leaving another job, a wood products manufacturing firm that was in Reno at that point in time. And so in February of 1995, I was all of a sudden looking for a job. So the first thing I did was call Jean Ford. And then I had a job. I didn't have a salary for a while, but I certainly had a job for the next couple of years. So I was the first treasurer of the Nevada Women's History Project.
And Lynn, how did you meet Jean and get roped in, you might say?
Well, I came back from the Peace Corps in June of '93, and I saw in the local paper that there was going to be a tour of the state capitol down in Carson City, and I thought, well, as long as I'm not going to be teaching anymore in Sacramento and living up at the lake full time, I better start finding out about Nevada. So I took the tour, and Jean was the tour leader. And I guess in the course of the tour and whatnot, we started talking, and after the tour was over, Jean and I went and had lunch together. And she started talking about history, and which was my thing. I love history. And so she started talking about the idea of doing a women's history project here, because there just wasn't that much history about women.
And this was when?
This was July of '93. And after that, Jean and I got to be very friendly. She used to come up to the lake, and we'd take Julie Carvel's had just published her book on lingering gardens. You know,
I love
that wasn't that a wonderful book? And we do some of those wonderful wildflower walks around the different parts around the lake, and over to Stampede Reservoir to see the camas lilies and all those wonderful things. So anyway, she got me roped into not only history in general of women's history, but she got me into doing tours, the Blue Line tours in Carson City.
Oh, right.
So that first summer I was really busy with Carson City history and whatnot. So that was great fun. And then I took her class, Women on the Frontier, Past and Present.
And Kathy?
My name is Kathy Noneman, and I was a family law attorney in practice with Barbara Finley and Noneman. I also did volunteer work at the court because they were trying to start the family court, and the law had just been passed where people could get protection orders against domestic violence. So as most volunteer jobs start, I started out, a couple of days here and there, and pretty soon, whenever I didn't have anything pressing to do in my practice, I was at the court. And one day in, I believe, the fall of '93 or the spring of '94, probably '94, I got a call from then Judge Deborah Auguste, who later became Supreme Court Justice Deborah Auguste, and she called me and said, "Kathy, there's someone I'd like you to meet." And I said, "Oh, who is that?" And she said, "Her name is Jean Ford, and I'm going to have a brown bag in my courtroom," and gave me the date and time, and I'm trying to get people to come and meet Jean Ford. So on the appointed day, I went, and there were, maybe 25 or 30 people from different areas of the court. And we were at 75 Court Street at the time. And so Jean passed out one of her ubiquitous kind of sampler, or a quiz, she called it, with about 30 questions, all about Nevada women's history. And of course, we all flunked because I don't think there was anybody in the room but Jean who knew anything about Nevada women's history.
That's a good one.
So she explained how she was starting this organization, and she wanted, interested people and that sort of thing. So when we finished all of this, Judge Auguste said to me, "Kathy, please come, and I want you to talk to Jean." Well, Jean was looking for particular people who were in selected occupations that she could then rope into being the person for that particular subject. So we had a brief conversation, and I told her my background, and that I, was an attorney and a history major, and I had been a teacher. And she got very excited and said, "You are my new expert on women attorneys in Nevada." And I said, "Well, really, the only thing I know is that there aren't very many of us." And she said, "Oh, but you have to go and find out all about the history of women lawyers in Nevada. And you are now my expert, which was a real laugh because I knew nothing about the history of women lawyers in Nevada. But boy, did I find out. Because you couldn't say no to Jean.
That's true.
No one. That was the key thing of her personality. Nobody could ever say no to Jean. And she had a way of minimizing what your activity and involvement would be. It was
Oh, sure.
always that it wouldn't take much time or effort. And before you knew it, you were spending your life devoted to Jean Ford.
Using the newsletter article that Janet White wrote in 1996, I believe, the genesis of the Nevada Women's History Project. Janet talked about a weekend retreat where she said the idea of a clearinghouse from the women's history was first discussed in '93 at Bev Hubbard's Tahoe House. And
It was
Lynn,
at-
you were there?
It was at Meeks Bay. And Bev and her husband had the state contract to manage Meeks Bay. And we were at the Kellett House. And it was after the season was over pretty much for the Meeks Bay Resort. And so I'm not sure exactly how long Bev and Jean knew each other prior to that, but the women I remember that were there at the first retreat, Anne Ronald, who was an English professor at the university, Lois Snedden, who was at the time the president of the local Sierra Club and a friend of Anne Ronald's, Sally Wilkins, who knew Jean through the Unitarian Universalist. And Betty Glass was there. There were several people from Carson City, and one of them was, and I can't remember Mary's last name, but she was a returned Peace Corps volunteer that Jean knew in Carson City. Roz Works, who worked at the State Museum at the time. Bev, of course. I think Sandra Neese was there, who taught in the home ec department at UNR.
Sandra Neese kind of got Jean that job, I think, up at the university.
At the university.
The women's studies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I remember Cheryl Kleinendorst, who was a student at the university, but she also kind of worked with Jean.
She was a photographer.
Yeah, well, that too. She did a number of things, but she was like an intern with Jean. And I think there were only about 20 of us that were at Meeks Bay because the house, didn't sleep that many people.
Let me just ask before you go on about what you talked about. Was it Betty Glass or Mary Ellen Glass?
Betty Glass.
It was Betty Glass.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
And it's not that we sort of sat around and talked. It was really kind of a fun time because we hiked and cooked and then in the evening we had an evening time, and that's sort of when the subject came up. And I think everybody was very interested, and it talked about sort of the women that they knew and didn't know, and just felt that it was would be a good thing to have. And then I don't know if that was the genesis. I think Jean must have been thinking about her course, which was then the next spring of '94, Women on the Frontier, Past and Present.
I'm going to skip now to what Janet said was the spring of 1994 when she talked about a nucleus that formed and that actual documentation of the Nevada Women's History Project occurred. I don't believe the name actually came up at that time. So
That was the one at the bank, I think. because that was where the woman from the Seroptimus and Kitty Rowe Roberts, who was African American, was there, and
The women from BPW.
yeah.
Well, one of Jean's strategies was she had a large steering committee.
Right.
And I seem to remember 30 women, but they all represented different organizations. So that was the way she got the different organizations to buy in, was to have them on this very large steering committee. And how that developed, I think, was having me write the bylaws.
That was later, I
That
think.
was later.
Yeah.
That
yeah.
was after the women's
This
fund
was,
got involved.
she actually produced a concept paper. Were any of you involved in that 1994 meeting that actually produced, this is, I'm assuming, what the Nevada Women's History Project was going to look at?
Was
Because
that the one at the Universalist
No,
Church?
the one
No,
at the
no.
Universal didn't occur
There may
until
have been.
about 1995.
But there may have been two out there. I kind of remember an earlier one. I remember 95 very well,
Yes.
but I kind of remember an early one.
Yeah,
But her concept paper, I do remember when she came to talk to me about this, there was a national movement at that time
right.
for women's history projects, and she brought a concept, I'm pretty sure, a concept paper at that time, and she brought this article that was in some newspaper that she brought at that time to talk to me about. I mean, she was really very clear about this whole organization and what it was going to look like and what it was going to do. So it wasn't real fuzzy. I mean, she had that paper, I'm pretty sure, done by then.
And when was that?
It would have been late 1994 or early 1995. I'm pretty sure because I look back and the few notes I have when I did a board. I always did a board review of the previous year, and I talked about the fact that the Nevada Women's History Project, and that would have been in January '95. That the Nevada Women's History Project had been accepted by the board of directors and would become a delegate agency. So it must have been late in 1994 when she came to talk with me.
The meeting at the Colonial Bank
Yeah, would have
was wasn't real organized.
been. No, it wasn't
These
like
these were mostly women that she kind of pulled together and from different
women's
organizations that she felt would be very interested. And I don't think there were more than 20 people there.
Yeah.
And it was sort of in a back room, and it was, it wasn't real formalized. And where she talked generally about the whole concept of around the country of these women's history projects. And I think she had just come back from Rutgers. She had gone to
Maybe that was
Rutgers
where it was.
to, which is, I guess, sort of the mother house of women's history at the time.
Well, I also think that meeting at the Colonial Bank, because there were the number of people that were there, and it was obvious it was going in a lot of different directions, and Jean wanted something concrete and to move forward. And so I think that's when she probably made a decision that the fewer people involved, the better it was going to be to organize and to keep it moving forward.
Yeah.
And she came to me with a list of about 5 states and that had women's history projects. I don't remember all of them,
No, I don't either.
but I think one was New Jersey.
Yeah.
The one I particularly remember was Nebraska, because she gave me locations of universities and places to get in touch with. And I was on the phone for a long time talking to these various organizers. And she wanted me to find out how they were organized and who was paying for this. And when I got to Lincoln, Nebraska, the woman was fabulous. She kept me on the phone for, it seemed like hours. talking about how they had gone to the Nebraska legislature and how they were being funded through the state, and what their bylaws were and everything. So I received sample organizational minutes and bylaws and that sort of thing from these different states. But the one that was the most exciting was Nebraska, because they had gone, quite far ahead. And so Jean really was excited about that group.
So that would have been early 1994. And then she revised, there is a document that says concept paper revised June of 94. And that was a point where there was going to be another meeting up at Lake Tahoe. That was canceled, and then you decided, this would have been November of 94, to go meet at the Unitarian Church.
Right, and by that time I had all the background information that Jean and I had worked on for how these other states were organizing. And I think by that time Jean had talked to several friends in the legislature, and they kind of said, not only no, but we're not giving you any money, kind of thing. They didn't care what Nebraska was doing.
At that point in time, or long about that point in time, she had asked me, at the beginning of 1995, she had asked me to be treasurer, but there was no money.
No.
Yeah.
Or no bank account or anything. So the one thing I found in my notes was reference to meeting her in the office so we could redo a grant. So she was actively looking for places to get money everywhere, and we redid this grant. And I believe the function for the grant was the women's suffrage presentation, because that all took place a few months later, like in April, and then later it took place in other places.
And that was a Nevada Humanities grant.
Okay,
That's where that money came from.
so she went out and found the grant, and then we just updated it.
Right, and that was her. That was the 75th anniversary of the national suffrage amendment in 1920. So it was to celebrate that 75th anniversary that she wrote the grant for the Nevada Humanities.
And subsequently, we had a pretty good, close relationship with Nevada Humanities, because
Yes.
I was up there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I can't
Yes.
remember now what I was always up there for, but
Right,
I had
right.
meetings up at Humanities with Judy Winsler and with Mary Toledo or something like that.
They were very, very supportive
Yeah,
early on.
yeah.
Yes. This is the time that Janet speaks about your purpose in the programming and the roles available for involvement of the new recruits. Do you remember having any discussions on, besides the normal chair and program person and treasurer, what did she look for, as well as other roles that people were going to
Well,
and this is before she started the groups, the organizations, I believe.
Well, one Saturday morning, she appeared at my house at about 8 in the morning. And about 8 that night, my husband Charlie came in and said, "I have dinner. Would you two take a break and eat?" And he fed us, and I think we then resumed until about 10 o'clock at night, setting up what the governing body of the organization would look like. And again, a lot of that information had come from how different states were doing it, how different organizations did it. And Jean had done a tremendous amount of research on how you set up a successful nonprofit.
And it was statewide too, because she
Yes.
had
Yeah.
to have the northern part and the southern part.
Yes, and we developed that marathon Saturday. We developed that structure on how it would be statewide and what the North group would look like and what the South group would look like. And eventually, she wanted to have a group in Elko
Elko,
and
oh, yeah,
Ely,
right.
and she really did want to expand.
Oh, I think at that time too, when she and I talked, I said, "Boy, you're gonna have a hard enough time dealing with Northern Nevada." You know, we learned that with the Women's Fund, and it was one reason why we were as successful as we were, is because we realized if we're going to raise money, we needed to do it in a smaller area, even though we called ourselves the Nevada Women's Fund. That it was just good. We just couldn't spread ourselves too thin, and I did say to her, you know, you need to think about that before you go out and expand. You need to get a strong foundation here, was how I really felt about it.
Well, since Jean had
So-
started in Las Vegas,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
she represented Las Vegas in the
Yes.
legislature, she knew a lot of people.
Yes, she did.
And I made several trips with her to Las Vegas while she was trying to organize. And I had that conversation a number of
Yeah,
times
yeah.
because
Yeah, it's just hard.
it was very, very difficult. The philosophy was different, and the goals and objectives were different. And so it was much easier for Jean than it was for the rest of us who were, you know, pretty northern Nevada and
Yeah, yeah.
provincial.
Because I know I drove with her down to Urington to talk to a senior citizens group there, and then out to Winnemucca one time to talk. So she really wanted to
Oh, yeah.
expand, but you know, it was pretty obvious when you got into those various areas that they weren't quite there.
Yeah, it was going to
Yeah,
take a lot
it was
of
going to
work.
take a while to get them to be any
Right.
kind of organized entities.
Well, and as I told her at the time too, I said, you know, you need staff if you're going to do
Right.
this. And if you're talking about a statewide coordinator or a person's going to coordinate this state because of the travel time. I mean, you're talking about hundreds
Oh,
of
yeah.
miles to deal with. And I said, so I really think if that's the route you want to go, then you need to make sure that you can afford to staff the office and staff a statewide coordinator. Because, I mean, we got into it with the Women's Fund. We were fortunate in that we had $20,000. We had $10,000 from Maya Miller and $10,000 from Barbara Thornton to start. So we had an office and we had an executive director and we rented space. And so we were off to a really good start. And I thought that was pretty important if you're going to go statewide.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously the local group rose to the occasion here
Yeah.
and were supported from the get-go.
And at that 1995 meeting in February, you talked about, and Fritzie, this is in your involvement, going out to the various organizations. And why was that important to involve as many organizations as there were?
Well, I think that was Jean's idea. You know, Women's Fund, we did not depend upon other organizations for what we were doing, other than for fundraising or some activities that we did. We did do some things with Seroptimist, etc. But I think she saw that as a way to really get people involved. You know, we started with a board of directors. The Women's Fund started with a board of directors of 36 women. So we did the same thing. We had everybody, attorneys, judges, elected officials, agriculture, and so we were spread out quite a bit. And so I think that's what she thought, that organizations would be very helpful. And maybe that came from what they did in Nebraska, I don't know.
And well, it also
Or some of the
came
other places.
from her research on how women obtained the right to vote in Nevada in 2014,
Oh, right.
because those were spearheaded
Yeah.
by women's organizations.
Yeah.
And she saw a long history in Nevada of getting things done by women organizing into groups and using the 20th Century Club, League of Women Voters, many different organizations that the women had to organize in order to get things done.
Yeah.
What was her approach to those organizations? In other words, when she would go to them, other than a membership, did she ask them for certain things, or just involvement of the members in the?
Pretty much depended upon it depended upon the members that she was going to court there. If there was somebody that had a particular interest, she would take advantage of that interest. And so we ended up at various times with AAUW functions, and a lot of overlap between our membership and their membership. There were several strong AAUW people, and so they would bring up our stuff at their meetings and vice versa. So
And that
it really
horrible
was
quiz.
dependent upon the people.
Well, and
The friends she
I
had
agree,
made.
the friends that she had made. And I think a lot of organizations like that have speakers.
Yeah.
When they meet for lunch or once a month or whatever, they have speakers, and so they're always looking for speakers. And she certainly was a great speaker and could get her point across.
And very persuasive.
Oh, yes.
And that quiz. She went around to organizations, and it was fun. Everybody got to take the quiz, and everybody realized how little they knew about women's history in Nevada. And she put us all to shame, and then said, well, I can fix this.
Right.
To me, one of her most compelling arguments was when she made her case for the fact that only guys' names were on these articles, and only men's names were on these books, and many of these books and these articles were written by the wives of the men, or the secretaries of the men, or whatever.
Right.
And I thought about every job I'd ever had, and it was that way. And so she didn't have to argue that point with me ever.
And-
I understood immediately. They just didn't get credit.
No, and those of us who had taught Nevada history knew that the textbooks we were using, the only woman who ever appeared with any regularity was, what's her name, the lady in Virginia City, the lady of the night.
Julia Boulette.
Julia Boulette.
Yeah, we all knew about Julia.
Everybody knew about Juliet, or Julie Boulette, but they didn't know about the many positive things that women had been doing for years
Well, one
in
thing
Nevada.
I think that was so wonderful about Jean is she knew Nevada so well, you know, from the tours that she had given. And she had met so many interesting men and women that part of the, fun of going on a tour through Nevada with Jean is you connected every town that you went to, that you connected with, groups of women that were very active and doing interesting things in their communities. And I think she made women take a second look at their own local history and take a great pride in it. And I think she wanted to share, all women of Nevada to share in that wonderful Nevada history that nobody really knew about. It was more than just casinos and
Right.
and gambling and whatnot.
Right.
I want to bring you to the meeting that was the November of '94 when 19 women signed up. And by June of 27th, I'm going to kind of combine those two when you elected officers. Of those early women, can you think of other women that had involvement in the group early on that we have not yet mentioned?
Is this the result of that meeting at the Universal?
This is after that.
After that?
After
More or less the officers. So you had Shane Del Cohen.
And
was
Shane
involved.
Delcone and I were head of the program
Yeah.
planning. And
Sylvia Antoneta Bonales was
Was it-
involved, or was she she was an intern? Because the Women's Fund gave her scholarships.
Right.
2 or 3 years, and I know she got very involved at that time.
And she did a
Was
lot
she
of
part
video.
of those
Yeah, she
nine?
did
Yes,
the video.
she,
Yes,
she,
she did.
yes, she did a video called Women Emerging in Public Life
Right,
in
yeah.
Nevada. And she did that for one of Jean's classes. She was also our first newsletter editor.
Though back at the 19 women that signed
Would
up.
Bobby Telso have been
Would
one
those-
of them?
Bobby Talso would have
Uh-huh.
been one of them, yes.
Yeah.
Shane Del Cone.
She would have
Um,
been one of those early
Bobby
19.
Telso was from the university.
Yeah,
The
no.
Unitarian
Unitarian,
University.
yeah.
Unitarian.
And they were
Um,
good friends.
Yeah,
Bobby Gang
Yeah,
was
Bobby
involved in the AUW at that
yeah,
time,
Nevada Women's Lobby.
Bobby.
and Women's Lobby, and
Was Mary Lee Fulkerson ever involved?
Mary Lee
Really
Fulkerson was involved, but
She and Jim did the tour
Yes.
in '89,
Oh,
in
right.
'98.
right. So, but she came on
Yeah.
later. But Mary Lee came on, and which was League of Women Voters,
Right.
and she came on early on.
Yeah.
So she would have been one of those 19.
She would have been one of those 19, I think.
Did we talk about Zola Ferguson? Was she there?
She was involved. Also, Penny Whalen from, was she? Oh, Zonta.
Yeah, Zonta.
Penny Whalen from Zonta was there early on.
Well, and I know May Shelton. She was kind of on the periphery because of her job with the social services, but
Right.
she was always pretty. I would assume that she did some financial support because she was very.
Right, and she
Generous.
also took pictures.
Yes.
Every
Oh,
time we
yes.
had a meeting,
That's right.
she took pictures. She also took pictures for the Women's Fund.
Oh, yeah, she still does.
Different activities, and she took pictures early on
Yeah.
of different meetings and get-togethers.
Right, right.
So,
And Sherry Rice.
Sherry Rice, because she was in charge of the Y
YW.
at the time. The
YW.
But it was,
the
late, it was
YWCA.
later that after Jean left the
Women's Studies University. Yeah.
left the office over there and
Moved over, yeah.
and
to
moved
the
into the Y.
Y.
But
Right.
what year was that? That was.
That was in '96
Six.
or
Oh,
'97.
96.
It might have been as close.
So I
to
remember
97.
we had some meetings at Jean's office up at
Oh,
the
we had a whole
university.
bunch of them.
Yeah.
You know, I know there were, I know Maya Miller
Oh, sure.
was involved, but never involved. I mean, she was a supporter. I know there were some of us that paid her salary at the university to keep her in women's studies. And Maya
Miller
Miller,
was probably one.
Right, and Barbara
Barbara
Thornton.
Thornton,
Barbara
Barbara
Thornton, Moya Lear, I think,
Yes.
did.
Yeah.
Let's see, yeah, Barbara Thornton.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they would they would never have gone to meetings
No,
and whatnot.
No.
No.
But they were financially
Right,
very
right.
supportive.
Zola Ferguson, Madeline Parsons, Barbara Spring. Barbara Spring was involved early on was Barbara a secretary maybe early on when Bev Hubbard was treasurer. I think Barbara Spring was either secretary or treasurer for a while there, and Barbara Spring was there at early meetings.
Well, and certainly Vicky Ford, since
And-
yeah.
Vicky wrote the book, but Vicky was also involved early on with this involvement.
Right, because Vicky Ford
Yeah.
was doing oral histories, and
Right.
Vicky Ford then did an oral history for the YWCA.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yes, and did a history of the YWCA.
I'd
we
like
could
to.
get in touch with Vicky Ford and you could ask her directly.
Will.
Because if she went to those meetings, then she might remember better than.
Yeah.
In summation, how do you feel about the contribution that Jean started in lasting for at least 25 years, and we hope longer? How do you feel that your involvement was of such importance?
Well, I mean, Jean was the foundation. She
Yeah.
was a cornerstone of the Nevada Women's History Project. And if you really think about it, of course, I had another job myself. Most everyone in the room had other jobs, and yet she managed to pull you in and get you excited and get you involved. And I just can't say enough for her, what she did and all of the different interests that she had. And I never ever saw her be angry. The only thing was the disappointment over some of the organizations that were not positive about the starting of the Women's History Project. But other than that, if things like kind of were going the way that she didn't particularly care, she always came around and she'd move you over. And she just was just such a wonderful person and just had this great personality. But it would never have been successful. I don't personally. I do not think it would have been as successful as it has been if it hadn't been for her leadership.
And the historians at the time were mostly men. I mean, the ones
Right.
people thought of, Jim Hulse and Ron James, Phil Earle, people like that. She really buttonholed them and said, you're only writing about men. You're writing textbooks. And Phil Earle was writing articles for the Historical Society. And she really badgered them into writing women into history. And that was the whole gist of it. She said, how am I expected to teach women's studies when, Jim Hulse, you haven't included them in your history book? Where do I send my students to find out these things? So she established relationships with the history department at UNR, at the oral history, at the Nevada Historical Society. With the people who were actually generating the history of Nevada.
I think one of the things, from her teaching the course, Nevada Women Pioneers on the Frontier, past and present, there was a long list of women that she had put together. Mm-hmm. And we were all to go out and research. Mm-hmm. And it was to be sort of the genesis of other research that could be done. And she was really great that way. I unfortunately had several occasions with Jean when she was not real happy.
So did I.
And very sad,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
cried.
Yes.
And I think that the lack of support she got from some of the academic women at the university was troubling to her.
Yes. I think
That she
in some
didn't
ways,
get that support,
Yes.
that they didn't support her efforts even though she didn't have a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes she felt she got more support from the men professors at UNR than the women, and she felt keenly that because she didn't have a PhD, they didn't respect her. The women professors didn't respect her the way that they should have.
That
I
was that was a moment, I think, or two that was
Really hard.
really hard for her to get over.
I had direct arguments with her about how to present the accounting for the organization because she wanted it to be the way she wanted it to be, and I didn't want to make a fool of myself by changing things that I knew should be in a certain kind of accounting format just because she didn't want it presented that way.
Well,
So we had direct fights about that.
and not necessarily, and I think that, she felt that sometimes that we felt she wouldn't let go of anything, that it was her baby. And that sometimes when people were trying to, do things in a maybe more open, transparent, or different way than Jean envisioned,
Yes.
that it was an issue for her that we thought she couldn't let go. And
She was a
That's
zealot.
sad. Yeah.
We did say she was
Yeah,
a zealot.
we did, but, it still saddened her that we,
Right.
would feel badly about her, or she thought we would feel badly.
I never felt like it was personal. I felt
No.
like it was
No.
just,
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
wanted it the way that she wanted it. And it was as if she was ignoring what I knew to be
Yeah.
an important criteria for the presentation of it. And so I couldn't, being stubborn myself, I couldn't just give in.
And yet there was a funny side to her too. I can remember having a conversation with her, and I know Bev and I have talked about this, because Bev had a similar
You're
conversation.
talking about Bev Hubbard.
Bev Hubbard, that she didn't, particularly in the early days and whatnot, why women followed her, why we thought so much of what, why we liked her so much and supported her so much.
She was fun.
She was a
Well,
force
I
of
know, but she
nature.
didn't, I think there was a part of her that didn't quite understand
A
that.
little self-esteem problem.
Right.
Maybe,
Yes,
yeah.
I think
Very-
so.
She was always a little bit surprised about
Right.
how women
Do you really love me?
liked her
Exactly.
and followed her.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
she was, we presented the serious Jean, and she was, but she was also great
Oh, yeah,
fun.
Oh,
when you were on a
absolutely.
trip with
Oh.
Jean, or
Absolutely.
a wildflower hike, or whatever it was, Jean was fun, interesting, and fun.
I'm going to end this with, and going just around the table and saying, knowing that your involvement in Nevada Women's History Project and seeing that it is still going 26 plus years later, how do you feel about your involvement, your contribution to Nevada Women's History?
I have had a wonderful time. If it weren't so much fun, I would have quit a long time ago. But it is fun. I like history. I like women. I, spent many years in dealing with women not at their best, and women in tragic circumstances and legal troubles and that sort of thing. But I always keep coming back for more because I genuinely like women. And I think, like Jean did, when we organize and cooperate and remember that we have a common goal, we do very well. And it's the women of the state of Nevada who have made it possible for a lot of the progress that we've been able to make. And so I feel that that's the contribution, not only in the history of women, but in the kinds of social progress that Nevada has made in the last 25 years.
Lynn?
There are two things. Of course, it was through her class that I got to know Mary Doughton and, did the anthology of Mary Doughton's writings, which was just a wonderful experience. But I think seeing Nevada through the tours with Jean, I got to know a side of Nevada that probably most people don't or won't have today that we had at that particular time. That there's much more to Nevada than just the gambling and the casinos and the glitz of Las Vegas. There's, the wonderful, communities out in the rural areas and people who are so committed to their lives in those particular places. And it was, I probably wouldn't have experienced that without my time with Jean and taking her class.
Linda?
I agree with both of them, in particular with Kathy talking about being a lawyer and not necessarily only wanting to hang out with lawyers. I didn't want to just hang out with accountants. I mean, it just didn't seem interesting to me because that was how I made my living. So these women in this group were a whole cross-section of people that I preferred to call my friends, I guess. And I also got to know, as a Canadian, I didn't get I didn't have to go to school and study Nevada history ever.
Oh,
So I
very
didn't
good.
know anything about the state of Nevada, and she just filled in a whole lot of blanks
Yeah.
for me. So that was wonderful. And also I felt useful because there weren't that many people in this group. Specifically, I felt useful because they needed accounting help.
A number person,
Yes, they
the
needed
bean
it.
counter.
They needed it.
Yes, they do.
Somebody to watch the
Yeah,
books.
I've always said that, when I started with the Nevada Women's Fund, of course, we had a chairman of the board, and we had treasurers, and we had secretary, et cetera. And about maybe the 7th or 8th year I was there, I said, the chairman of this board really does not matter that much to me. The person who really makes the difference is the treasurer, because they can explain the money and where that money is, and it's a big responsibility when you're raising large amounts of money and the banking and the accounting and dealing with the auditors, et cetera. So I really love accountants, and even when they came to the Women's Fund, they didn't want to do that. They wanted to do something else, but eventually they find that's their niche where they belong.
They can't stand
No.
anyone to screw it up.
No.
And they listen and they listen, oh no, I better do this.
Yeah, I've been through that. But my experience, as I said before, was just wonderful. And the Women's Fund was great for me too, because it was a wide variety of women that I probably would have never known in the life that I had at the time. And again, with the Women's History Project, I got to know a lot of other women, and I wasn't all that involved except, to go to the meetings and to kind of follow along with what was being done and what the treasurer was doing. But I just can't say enough about the experience, and I just feel so blessed that I have been a part of it.
And I would like to say here too that I don't think we would have survived without the Nevada Women's Fund.
Well,
Oh, we wouldn't.
Because
I don't
we
think so either.
having those kind of gentle arms wrapped around us.
And financial legitimacy.
Yes, gave us legitimacy, gave us cred, and so I think that was a great part of it, Fritzy, having you and the Women's Fund to protect us. I think went a long way to ensuring that Jean survived and that we survived after Jean's death.
Well, it was a great partnership. I never regretted one day, not one day, of being with that partnership of the Women's History Project. It was always a joy, and I just can't say enough about it. So, thank you too.
Thank you all.
I don't think we'd have the office there today if it hadn't.
Well,
continued.
really, when you think about it, because I've fretted about that over years. How are we going to get them into a building with us? And yet I had to depend upon free. I mean, I moved 6 times into free, and finally, when we decided to do that larger office, I said, "Oh boy!" I said, "I want a space for that Women's History Project."
Oh, isn't that
and,
wonderful?
Oh, I was just thrilled.
And it's really safe.
And we've been
Isn't
thrilled.
it?
Yeah,
It's a very nice and very convenient, and it's a good place to
Yeah.
be.
yeah.
Well, ladies, thank you very much.
Well,
And
thank
hope
you.
Did we
that
sound
we
coherent?
do-
Yes.
yeah, we do the same for the Nevada Women's Fund.
Okay, so now we're just recording the spellings and the title. Let's start with Patty.
Patty Bernard, NWHP Oral History Chairman.
And spelling of your name?
Bernard, and the first is Patti.
Thank you.
Fritzy, Fritsi, Erickson, Ericson, and I was president and CEO of the Nevada Women's Fund from late 1984 to 2005.
Linda Wyckoff, LindaWyckoff, and I was the first treasurer of the Nevada Women's History Project.
Great.
Kathy Noneman, KathyNoneman, and I was the first NWHP program co-chair.
Thank you.
Lynn Bramer, LYNNBREMER, and I was the first secretary of the Nevada Women's History Project.
Perfect. Thank you.